Dawn over Piney Fork, Arkansas. Fog sitting low on Bitter Creek. A woman in a canvas coat drags a car hood across frost-stiffened grass, metal shrieking against stone. 61 years old, hands wrapped in electrical tape instead of gloves. Behind her, a hillside of scrap, culvert pipe, box springs, rebar, a school bus door rusted the color of dried blood. She doesn't stop to catch her breath. She measures a length of pipe with a carpenter's pencil, marks it, drags it toward a trench she's dug herself, one shovel load at a time for 11 straight days. A neighbor's porch light clicks on across the road. Curtains move. Nobody crosses the fence to ask what she's doing. They've already decided they know. By the time the sun clears the ridge, she has laid 4 sections of pipe end to end, packed with clay, aimed like a rifle barrel at the old quarry pit behind her orchard. She stands over it, wipes her forehead with a wrist still taped in electrician's tape, and says only to no one, just a little more time. What she's building has no name yet. What it's for, not one soul in Izard County has guessed correctly. If you're the kind of person who slows down for a story like this one, go ahead and hit subscribe. It costs nothing, and it means a great deal to a channel like mine. Drop a comment and let me know what corner of the world you're watching from tonight. Now, let's go back to the beginning to understand why a grown woman was hauling junk metal up a hill alone. Her name was Marlene Ostrander, and she had lived her whole life on 40 acres above Bitter Creek, 3 miles outside the town of Piney Fork, in the hill country of Izard County, Arkansas. Her grandfather had cleared the orchard by hand in 1938. Her father had grafted the Arkansas black apple trees that still bore fruit every October, gnarled and stubborn as the family that tended them. Marlene had buried both parents in the little cemetery behind the Baptist church, and buried her husband there too, 12 years back, of a heart that had simply grown tired. Since then it was Marlene alone and her younger sister Fern who lived in town and came out most Sundays with a casserole dish and a worried look. The orchard had always scraped by. Not rich, never rich, but steady in the way that hill farms are steady if you don't ask too much of the land or the weather. Then came the flood of 2 years prior. Bitter Creek had risen in a single violent night and taken half the orchard's topsoil down to bedrock, drowned 900 young trees, and left the county road buried under gravel for a month. The Ostranders had no flood insurance. Small hill farms rarely did. What they had instead was a property tax bill that kept climbing while the harvest that was supposed to pay it kept shrinking. Marlene's kitchen table told the story better than any words could. A cracked coffee mug held down a stack of envelopes from the Izard County tax collector, each one a shade more official than the last, the most recent stamped in red. Some mornings Fern found her sister sitting there before sunrise, not crying, just staring at that stamp like it was a face she was trying to place. Word around town was simpler and less kind. Marlene Ostrander had lost her mind after her husband died, and now she was dragging garbage up onto her hillside like some kind of magpie building a nest out of car doors and drain pipe. Her nearest neighbor, a retired lineman named Gareth Loomis, complained loudest and often at the feed store and the church steps alike. "Woman's got a junkyard where an orchard used to be," Gareth told anyone who'd listen. "Rats'll come next, snakes after that. Somebody ought to make her clean it up before it brings the whole road down in value." Enough people agreed with him, or were too polite to disagree, that eventually somebody picked up the phone and called the county. Sheriff Odell Bracey drove out on a gray Tuesday afternoon, boots crunching gravel, clipboard under his arm. He wasn't cruel about it. He liked Marlene, had known her since grade school. But a complaint was a complaint, and the pile on her hillside was, by any reasonable measure, enormous. "Marlene," he said, standing at the fence line, "I got 3 separate calls about this. County nuisance code says accumulated scrap's gotta go, or I got to write you up." She didn't argue. She didn't explain either, which unsettled him more than an argument would have. She only asked for time, 6 weeks, she said, maybe less. Odell studied the culvert pipe half buried in her hillside, The trench cut like a wound toward the old quarry and could make no sense of any of it. He wrote down a warning instead of a citation and told her the clock was ticking either way. Marlene had good reason not to explain. The tax collector's own auction notice sat folded in her coat pocket that very day. Unless the delinquent balance was paid in full, the Ostranger orchard would go to public auction on the courthouse steps in 42 days. She had one harvest left to try to save the land her grandfather cleared, and one growing worry that another flood off Bitter Creek would finish what the last one started. That was the truth of it. The county levee downstream, an earthen berm built back in the 1960s, had cracked in 3 places during the last flood and never been properly repaired. The county said there wasn't money, not this year, maybe not next year either. If the creek rose hard again before harvest, it wouldn't just threaten Marlene's remaining trees. It would come down through the low road into Piney Fork itself, same as it nearly had before. So Marlene had stopped waiting on the county. She had gone instead to Purnell's salvage 2 towns over, and to every ditch and barn lot she could reach, and started hauling home anything made of steel that still had shape to it. She was building a diversion, a buried spillway of scrap culvert and packed clay, cutting across the hillside above her orchard, meant to catch the worst of any flood surge and bleed it sideways into the old quarry pit, instead of letting it run straight down onto her trees and the road below. She had learned the shape of it from her father's old engineering primer, dog-eared and water-stained, and from watching, for 61 years, exactly which way the water wanted to go when the creek came up mean. She trusted the land more than she trusted any promise from the county courthouse. What she did not have was money for new pipe, or time to waste on people who thought she'd lost her senses. Fern came out one Sunday with the casserole and found her sister up to her knees in the trench, sweat-soaked, hauling clay by the bucketful. "Marlene, honey, you are going to work yourself into the grave same as your husband," Fern said, setting the dish on the tailgate. "Whole town thinks you've gone simple. Gareth's telling people you're building a bunker for the end times." Marlene only laughed. "Short and tired. Let them think what helps them sleep," she said. "I've got 42 days and about 400 more feet of pipe I need and can't afford. Come hold this level for me or go on home." Fern, muttering, climbed down into the ditch beside her. For 3 weeks the work went slow but steady. Marlene traded eggs and apple butter for old fence panels. She stripped a collapsed hog barn down to its bones. She learned to weld well enough to patch culvert joints, burning her forearm twice and her pride not once. The pile of junk on the hillside grew, and so did the whispering in town, and so did the balance owed on that tax bill, because interest doesn't wait on anybody's engineering plans. Then in the 5th week, the setback came. Purnell's salvage shut its gate for good. Old man Purnell had died, and his son was selling the whole lot to a scrapper out of Little Rock who wanted cash on delivery, more than Marlene had left. Her truck's transmission gave out the same week, stranding her without a way to haul what little scrap she could still scrounge. She sat on her porch steps that evening with the tax notice in her lap, and for the first time since the flood, let herself believe she'd run out of road. Sheriff Bracy drove by that same week with a formal notice this time, not a warning, clean up the pile within 14 days, or face a fine on top of everything else she owed. Standing at her fence, clipboard in hand, he looked almost sorry to hand it to her. "I don't make the rules, Marlene," he said, "but rules don't care much for reasons either." That night Marlene walked the unfinished trench alone by lantern light, counting the gaps still open, the pipe still missing, the days still owed. She thought about her father grafting trees he'd never lived to see full grown, planting for a harvest that wasn't his to gather. She thought about quitting. Then she thought about the low road into town, and the schoolhouse sitting square in the water's path if that levee ever gave for good. By first light she was back in the trench with a hand shovel and what pipe remained, laying it shorter and rougher than planned, patching gaps with flattened barrels and salvaged rebar mesh instead of proper culvert. It would not be the spillway her father's primer had drawn. It would have to be enough. Fern came without being asked, and brought Gareth's own nephew, a quiet boy named Silas who'd always liked Marlene better than his uncle did, to help haul what the broken truck no longer could. The storm came 9 days before the auction, in the second week of October, a slow green sky over Bitter Creek that everyone in Piney Fork knew to be afraid of. Rain fell for 11 hours straight. By midnight the creek had climbed its banks. By 2 in the morning, word came over the volunteer fire radio that the old county levee had split wide along its worst crack, exactly where everyone always feared it would. Sheriff Bracy was among the first down to the low road with his spotlight, expecting to find it already underwater the way it had been 2 years before. Instead he found the road dry, and the creek's surge running hard along a channel it had never run before sideways, off Marlene's hillside, pouring in a brown torrent down into the old quarry pit instead of down into town. He stood in the rain with his light shaking in his hand, staring at water doing something water wasn't supposed to do on its own. By dawn half of Piney Fork had come out to see it. Gareth Loomis stood at the fence he'd complained across for 2 years, watching floodwater churn into the quarry through a scar of buried pipe and packed clay he'd once called a junk pile, and said not one word. Fern found Marlene standing over her own spillway in the gray morning light, exhausted, soaked through, watching the orchard behind her sit untouched while the low road stayed dry, and the schoolhouse stayed dry, and every soul who doubted her stood there seeing it with their own eyes instead of hearing it from hers. Nobody made a speech. Nobody needed to. Silas waited along the channel's edge, laughing out loud at the sight of it holding. Sheriff Bracy walked the length of it twice, checking joints she'd welded herself, and finally just shook his head and folded up the notice still sitting in his coat pocket, the one he'd never gotten around to enforcing. The harvest that October came in whole. Marlene sold every bushel of Arkansas black apples the orchard had left to give, paid the county to the last delinquent dollar, and watched the auction notice get pulled from the courthouse board 6 days before her land would have gone up for bid. Gareth Loomis, of all people, showed up that winter with a truckload of scrap steel he no longer had use for and asked, plain and quiet, if she could still use it. She could. She always could. The hillside above her orchard still holds that buried channel today, grown over now with Johnson grass and black-eyed Susans, invisible to anyone who doesn't know to look for the seam in the ground. Piney Fork remembers it differently than they remember most things, not as the year the levee broke, but as the year a woman's junk pile decided which way the water was going to go. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double CH.